parade was in full swing at Arlington Cemetery when 8-year-old Emma raised her tiny hand. In a gesture most would miss, but Guard Sergeant Jake Morrison saw it end in that instant. Everything stopped. What happened next left thousands speechless and one little girl's family in tears. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button if you believe small gestures can carry the biggest meanings. Asterisk, the morning sun casts long shadows across the pristine grounds of Arlington National Cemetery, each beam of light seeming to illuminate the sacred silence that hung over America's most hallowed ground. It was Memorial Day 2023, and thousands of visitors had gathered for the annual wreath-laying ceremony, their voices hushed by the weight of history beneath their feet. Among them stood Sergeant Jake Morrison, a 28-year-old member of the 3rd Infantry Regiment's Honor Guard. His dress blues so immaculate they seemed to absorb and reflect the morning light simultaneously. Jake had been guarding the tomb of the unknown soldier for 3 years now, each day a meditation on duty, honor, and the price of freedom. Before that, two brutal tours in Afghanistan had left their mark. A Purple Heart he kept in a drawer and never displayed, a bronze star that felt heavier than it should, and a jagged scar running from his right elbow to his wrist where shrapnel had found its mark during an IED explosion outside Kandahar. The wound had healed, but it still ached when storm fronts moved through D.C., a permanent reminder of brothers who hadn't made it home. At 6'12", with the rigid posture that came from years of military bearing, Jake commanded respect without uttering a word. His steel-gray eyes had seen too much for someone his age. Friends lost in desert firefights, families shattered by folded flags, the hollow stare of combat veterans struggling to find meaning in a world that seemed impossibly far from the brotherhood forged under fire. But those same eyes had also learned to notice everything, every detail, every person, every moment that might matter in the endless vigil he kept over America's honored dead. His black hair was regulation short, trimmed every 2 weeks without fail, his jaw clean-shaven with the precision of someone who understood that appearance reflected respect for those he served. The white gloves on his hands were spotless despite having been on duty since 0500, each finger positioned with the exactness that came from thousands of hours of practice. The Honor Guard badge on his chest wasn't mere decoration, it was earned through 6 months of grueling training that eliminated 3/4 of applicants. Memorizing the name and story of every service member buried in Section 60, learning to march with mechanical precision while carrying the emotional weight of a nation's gratitude. The ceremony today felt different from the dozens Jake had participated in before. The crowds were larger, the media presence more intense, and there was a special presentation planned for the families of the fallen Gold Star families, who carried their grief with the same quiet dignity that marked the cemetery itself. Maybe it was the young widows in the front rows, children clutching photos of fathers they barely remembered, or the way the morning mist seemed to cling to the white headstones, like whispered prayers that would never reach their intended recipients. In the crowd, positioned about 50 feet from the ceremony platform where dignitaries would soon speak about sacrifice and service, stood the Chen family. David Chen, a 34-year-old software engineer from Seattle, held the hand of his 8-year-old daughter Emma, while his wife Sarah adjusted their 10-year-old son Tommy's tie, with the focused attention of a mother who understood the importance of showing proper respect. They traveled 3,000 miles to be here, not as tourists seeking a memorable experience, but as a family carrying a secret burden that would soon change everything for everyone present. Emma was small for her age, with dark pigtails that bounced when she moved and bright brown eyes that seemed to absorb every detail of the world around her. She wore a simple blue dress decorated with tiny white flowers, her special occasion dress, as she'd called it when her mother helped her choose it for this trip. In her free hand, she clutched a small American flag, the kind they distributed to children at parades and ceremonies, its fabric barely larger than her palm, but somehow carrying the weight of everything her family had taught her about honor and sacrifice. But Emma wasn't just any child attending any ceremony. She carried knowledge that most adults would never fully understand, wisdom passed down through bedtime stories and quiet conversations that her parents thought she was too young to fully grasp. For 2 years, since she was old enough to understand the concept of war and loss, David Chen had told his daughter stories about her grandfather, the grandfather she would never meet, the soldier who had died in Afghanistan 3 months before she was born, the hero whose presence shaped their family even in his absence. Staff Sergeant James Chen had been 42 when an IED destroyed his convoy outside Kabul. making him one of the older casualties of America's longest war. He joined the Army at 38, after watching the towers fall on September 11th and deciding he couldn't sit on the sidelines, while younger men and women carried the burden of defending freedom. His age and life experience had made him a natural leader, the kind of soldier who volunteered for the dangerous missions and always brought his people home. Until the day he couldn't bring himself home. David had been 24 when his father deployed, fresh out of college and working his first job in tech, still struggling to understand why a man with a comfortable life and a growing family would choose to leave it all behind for the uncertainty of combat. They'd argue before the deployment, harsh words about duty versus family, about whether service to country should come before service to children and grandchildren. Who needed their patriarch present, not just honored now, standing in Arlington Cemetery with his own children? David finally understood what his father had tried to tell him during their last phone call from Afghanistan. Some things are bigger than us, son. Some things are worth the risk because without them, nothing else matters. James Chen had died believing in those words, and his son had spent 8 years learning to live with them. Emma had absorbed these stories with the intensity children bring to fairy tales, except these weren't stories about kingdoms far away. They were about the man whose photo hung in their hallway, the soldier whose medals sat in a place of honor on their mantelpiece, the grandfather who had taught her father to shoot and fish and stand up for what was right. She knew that Grandpa James had been killed by a bomb, that he died protecting other soldiers, that he was buried in a special place where heroes rested. But Emma also knew something else, something her parents thought was too complex for an 8-year-old mind to retain: her grandfather's exact location in Arlington Cemetery. David had memorized every detail of his father's funeral, down to the section number, row, and grave marker, and he'd shared these details during his stories without realizing how carefully his daughter was listening. Section 60, row 7, 4, stones in from the eastern path. Emma had made her father repeat these directions so many times that Sarah finally asked if they should be concerned about their daughter's obsession with death and burial places. What they didn't know was that Emma had also absorbed other lessons from her grandfather's legacy. David had told her about the military training James had shared during his visits home, the survival skills and emergency signals that had kept him alive through 3 deployments. Before his final mission, one of those lessons had been about the international distress signal: 3 short, 3 long. 3 short 10, how a soldier should always be watching for someone who needed help, even if that someone couldn't speak the words aloud. If you ever need help from a soldier, Emma, David had told her, repeating words his father had once spoken to him, you give them the signal Grandpa taught us. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. Any real soldier will know what that means, and they'll help you. It had been part of a longer conversation about safety and strangers, a parent's attempt to give his child tools for protecting herself in a dangerous world. Emma had practiced the signal in her bedroom mirror, her small fist moving in the precise pattern her father had demonstrated. She'd used it as a game with Tommy, pretending to be soldiers sending secret messages across enemy territory. But today, walking through Arlington Cemetery toward her grandfather's final resting place, Emma understood that the signal wasn't a game anymore. Today, she had a mission that her grandfather would have understood. She needed to tell someone where he was, needed to make sure that the soldiers who guarded this sacred place knew that Staff Sergeant James Chen was here, that he mattered, that his sacrifice was remembered by a granddaughter who loved him, despite never feeling his arms around her. The ceremony began with military precision that would have made Staff Sergeant James Chen proud. The honor guard marched in perfect formation, their boots striking the pavement in synchronization so exact it sounded like a single footfall, multiplied by 20. Jake took his position near the eastern edge of the gathering, his role to observe and ensure the safety and dignity of the proceedings, while maintaining the respectful distance that allowed families to grieve and remember without feeling watched or judged. His trained eyes swept the crowd with the automatic vigilance of someone who had learned it. Afghanistan, the threats could emerge from anywhere, at any time. Veterans in wheelchairs, their service evident in their bearing despite their physical limitations. Children perched on their father's shoulders to see over the adults, their young faces solemn with an understanding that went beyond their years. Elderly women clutching photographs of young men who would never age beyond their final military portraits. Widows whose grief had aged into a quiet strength. that commanded respect from everyone around them. As the chaplain began his invocation, his words carrying across the assembled crowd like a prayer made audible. Jake noticed the Chen family. The father stood at attention despite being a civilian, his posture suggesting military bearing, not the casual straightness of someone trying to look respectful, but the unconscious positioning of someone who had learned proper military stance through family connection or personal service. The mother kept glancing at her daughter with a mixture of pride and nervousness, the way parents do when they're hoping their children will behave appropriately in important situations. But it was Emma who caught and held Jake's attention. While other children fidgeted with their clothes, whispered questions to their parents, or played quietly with phones handed down to keep them occupied during the solemn ceremony, Emma stood perfectly still. Her small face carried an expression of seriousness that seemed to mature for her age. Her bright brown eyes fixed not on the ceremony, not on the speakers or the honor guard formation, but directly on Jake himself. There was something in her gaze that set every instinct Jake had developed through 3 years of ceremonial duty and to combat deployments on high alert. This wasn't the usual curiosity children showed toward soldiers in dress uniform. That mixture of fascination and slight fear that came from seeing someone who represented both protection and power. This was something deeper, more purposeful. Recognition, perhaps, though Jake was certain he'd never seen this child before. Or determination, the look of someone who had a mission to complete and was waiting for the right moment to act. Jake had learned to trust his instincts long before he'd learned to march in formation. In Afghanistan, the ability to read faces, to sense when something wasn't quite right in a crowd or a situation, had kept him alive when other soldiers hadn't been as fortunate. That same internal radar was pinging now, not with danger, but with the awareness that this little girl was trying to communicate something important. The ceremony continued with its carefully orchestrated progression of speeches from dignitaries, the laying of wreaths by representatives from various military organizations, and the haunting notes of taps played by a lone bugler, whose music seemed to give voice to all the grief and gratitude that words couldn't express. Families wept quietly. Veterans saluted with the automatic precision of muscle memory that outlived active service, and tourists captured moments they would later struggle to explain to friends who hadn't experienced the profound weight of standing among America's honored dead. But through all of this, Jake's peripheral vision kept returning to Emma Chen. She hadn't moved from her position, hadn't looked away, hadn't broken her focused attention on him for even a moment. Her parents were absorbed in the ceremony. Her brother was watching the honor guard formation with the fascination typical of 10-year-old boys who dreamed of becoming soldiers themselves. But Emma remained locked in her silent communication with a soldier she'd never met near the end of the formal proceedings. As the honor guard prepared to march in their final formation, the culminating moment when 20 soldiers would move as one in a display of precision that represented the unity and discipline of the American military, Jake noticed Emma step slightly forward from her family's position. Her father reached for her hand, the automatic parental gesture of keeping a child close in a crowded public space. But Emma shook her head gently and took another small step toward the ceremony area. That's when Jake saw her raise her right hand. At first glance, to anyone not trained in military communications, it would have looked like a child's wave, the kind of innocent gesture that might make a soldier smile and nod in return. A sweet moment of connection between the military and the civilians they served. But Jake's blood ran cold as he recognized what Emma was actually doing. Her tiny fist was closed tight, her thumb extended upward, and she was moving it in a specific, deliberate pattern that no 8-year-old should have known without very specific instruction. 3 short movements, 3 long, deliberate motions, 3 short again. The international distress signal, SOS, the universal call for help that transcended language barriers and civilian military divides. A signal that no soldier could ignore, no matter what protocol or procedure might say about maintaining formation or following orders. Jake's mind raced through possibilities. With the speed of someone trained to assess threats and respond appropriately. Was Emma in immediate physical danger? Was someone in the crowd threatening her or her family? Was this some kind of elaborate prank or misunderstanding the child, who had learned a military signal without understanding its serious implications? But the expression on Emma's face, the deliberate precision of her movements, the way she maintained eye contact while signaling, told him this was no game. A child didn't learn the international distress signal by accident. Someone had taught her. and someone had taught her well enough that she could execute it perfectly under pressure, in front of thousands of people, while maintaining the composure to ensure that the right person would see and understand her. Message. Jake had been trained extensively in handling disruptions, emergencies, and security threats during formal ceremonies. The protocol was clear and had been drilled into every member of the honor guard until it became automatic. Assess the situation, communicate with your chain of command, and respond proportionally to the level of threat present. But no training manual, no protocol book, no emergency procedures guide had covered this specific scenario. An 8-year-old girl giving military distress signals during a Memorial Day ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery. He needed to act, but he needed to act intelligently. Breaking protocol without proper justification could end his military career and potentially compromise the safety and dignity of the ceremony for thousands of attendees. But ignoring a distress signal, especially one given by a child, violated every principle he'd sworn to uphold when he'd taken the oath to protect and serve the American people. Jake caught the eye of his partner, Corporal Martinez, who was positioned near the western side of the gathering. Martinez had been in the honor guard for 18 months and had proven himself reliable under pressure, the kind of soldier who could read situations quickly and respond appropriately, using subtle hand signals that the public wouldn't notice, but any honor guard member would recognize immediately. Communications developed for exactly this kind of situation. Jake indicated a potential issue requiring immediate attention and possible assistance. Martinez nodded almost imperceptibly, the tiny movement barely visible to someone not watching for it, and began moving closer to Jake's position while maintaining the appearance of normal ceremonial positioning. His movement was smooth and professional, the kind of adjustment that looked like routine protocol to civilian observers, but signaled to Jake that backup was available if the situation escalated beyond what one soldier could handle alone. Meanwhile, Emma continued her signal, not frantically, not with the panic that might accompany a child in immediate physical danger, but with the patient persistence of someone who understood that the right person would eventually see and respond to her communication. Her parents remained focused on the ceremony, unaware of their daughter's actions, but clearly proud of her respectful behavior during such an important event. The crowd around them was absorbed in the solemnity of the moment, their attention fixed on the speakers and the honor guard formation. Jake made his decision with the certainty that had served him well in Afghanistan, and in 3 years of ceremonial duty, he would respond to the distress signal, whatever the consequences to his career or the disruption to the ceremony. A child had asked for help using a signal that transcended civilian protocols and military regulations. His duty was clear, even if the path forward wasn't. The honor guard's final march was beginning, the moment when Jake would normally take his position in formation and march with mechanical precision while thousands of people watched in respectful silence. Instead, he made eye contact with Emma one final time, saw her repeat the SOS signal with the same patient urgency, and did something that would be talked about in military circles for years to come. He stopped the entire parade. Honor guard, halt. Jake's command voice cut through the morning air with the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed instantly and without question. The entire formation stopped mid-stride, 20 pairs of polished boots hitting the pavement in perfect unison one final time, before absolute stillness descended over the ceremony area. The crowd fell silent with the sudden awareness that something unplanned, something unprecedented, was happening before their eyes. Major Patricia Hayes, the commanding officer overseeing the ceremony and Jake's direct superior, looked at him with a mixture of surprise and concern that quickly shifted to professional assessment. In her 15 years of military service, including her own combat deployment to Iraq, she had learned to trust her soldiers' judgment in critical situations. But she had also learned that deviation from protocol during formal ceremonies could have consequences that rippled far beyond the immediate moment. In 3 years of service under Major Hayes' command, Jake had never deviated from protocol during a formal ceremony. He was known for his reliability, his attention to detail, and his ability to maintain composure under pressure. If Jake Morrison was breaking formation during a Memorial Day ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery with thousands of witnesses and multiple news cameras rolling, he had to have a compelling reason. Her training told her to trust her soldiers' judgment, especially soldiers with combat experience who had proven their decision-making abilities under the ultimate pressure. But her responsibility to the ceremony, to the families present, and to the military's reputation told her to maintain order and minimize disruption to what was supposed to be a solemn tribute to America's fallen heroes. Jake stepped out of formation, a breach of protocol that could potentially end military careers, and began walking directly toward the Chen family. His movements were controlled and professional, but purposeful enough that the crowd began to murmur with the kind of nervous energy that accompanies unexpected events at formal occasions. Security personnel stationed throughout the ceremony area started moving, unsure whether this was some kind of planned addition to the program or something they needed to address as a potential security concern. The murmur of the crowd grew louder as Jake's path became clear. This wasn't a routine adjustment to formation or a predetermined part of the ceremony. This was a soldier, acting on his own authority, approaching a family in the middle of a formal military proceeding. Phones came out, cameras started rolling, and what had been a solemn ceremony became a moment of national attention, focused on whatever was about to happen between a soldier and an 8-year-old girl. As Jake approached, David Chen's face showed the confusion and concern of a parent whose family had suddenly become the center of attention at a public event. His military bearing became more pronounced, the unconscious straightening that came from years of hearing his father talk about proper behavior in the presence of active duty service members. Sarah Chen instinctively moved closer to her children, the protective reflex of a mother who sensed that their family was about to become involved in something significant and potentially life-changing. Tommy, their 10-year-old son, stared wide-eyed at the approaching soldier, his young mind trying to process why one of the honor guard members was walking directly toward them instead of marching with his unit. But Emma stood her ground with the composure of someone much older than her 8 years, her small hand still positioned in the distress signal, her bright brown eyes never leaving Jake's face as he covered the distance between them. The crowd pressed closer, sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Veterans in the crowd straightened their shoulders, recognizing the gravity in Jake's bearing and the precision of his movements. Gold Star families watched with a particular intensity of people who understood that military ceremonies sometimes contained moments of profound personal significance that went far beyond public pageantry. "Good morning, young lady," Jake said as he reached the Chen family, his voice gentle but carrying enough authority to quiet the surrounding crowd. He knelt down to Emma's eye level, bringing his 6 feet to inches framed down to meet her gaze directly, a gesture that transformed him from an imposing figure in military dress to a soldier, making himself accessible to a child who needed his help. The symbolism of the moment wasn't lost on the crowd. Here was a member of the elite honor guard, trained to march with mechanical precision and maintain the dignity of military ceremony, kneeling in front of an 8-year-old girl in recognition that her message was more important than protocol, more significant than the carefully scripted proceedings that had brought thousands of people to Arlington Cemetery that morning. "I'm Sergeant Morrison," Jake continued, his voice carrying the warmth that came from experience working with military families, especially children who had grown up in the shadow of service and sacrifice. "I noticed you were trying to tell me something important." Emma nodded solemnly, her young face carrying an expression of relief and determination. "My grandpa taught me that signal," she said, her voice small but clear enough to carry to the people pressed close around them. "He said if I ever needed to tell a soldier something really important, something that couldn't wait, I should use it and a real soldier would listen." David Chen stepped forward, his face flushed with the embarrassment of a parent whose child had disrupted a formal public event, but also with growing awareness that his daughter's actions were connected to the stories he'd been telling her about her grandfather. "I'm so sorry, Sergeant. She's been fascinated by military ceremonies ever since her grandfather." He stopped, the words catching in his throat as he realized that Emma's behavior might not be simple childhood curiosity or inappropriate attention-seeking. Jake held up a gentle hand to stop David's apology, his attention remaining focused entirely on Emma. Years of working with Gold Star families during ceremonies at Arlington had taught him that children often carried messages that adults couldn't see, understood connections that seemed impossible. Given their age and experience, military children, especially those who had lost family members to combat, often possessed an intuitive understanding of service and sacrifice that went far beyond what their parents thought they could grasp. "What did you need to tell me, Emma?" Jake asked, his voice carrying the patient attention of someone who understood that this moment, whatever it led to, was exactly why he had chosen to serve in the honor guard, not for the ceremony itself, not for the public recognition or the perfect uniforms, but for moments when the living needed to connect with the dead, when families needed a bridge between their private grief and the public honor accorded to their fallen heroes. Emma looked back at her parents, seeking the permission that well-raised children asked for before sharing family information with strangers, even strangers in uniform. Sarah Chen nodded encouragingly, her own eyes beginning to fill with tears as she sensed the magnitude of what her daughter was about to reveal. David Chen placed a supportive hand on Emma's shoulder, the gesture giving her permission to speak. The words that had brought their family 3,000 miles to stand in this cemetery on this particular day. Emma turned back to Jake, took a deep breath with the seriousness of someone preparing to deliver a message that had been entrusted to her by someone she loved, and spoke the words that would transform this Memorial Day ceremony into something none of the thousands of witnesses would ever forget. Grandpa said I should tell a soldier where he is, Emma said, her voice gaining strength and clarity as she continued. He said someone should know, someone who guards the soldiers who can't come home. He said it was important that the soldiers here know that Staff Sergeant James Chen is here too, that he's not forgotten, that someone still remembers what he did. The words hit Jake like a physical blow, the kind of impact that comes not from violence, but from the sudden understanding that a moment you thought was routine has become something that will stay with you for the rest of your life. In that instant, he understood everything. This wasn't a child playing games with military signals she learned by accident. This wasn't even a simple case of a granddaughter missing a grandfather she'd never met. This was a young soldier because that's what Emma had become in this moment, carrying out a final mission for a fallen hero. Where's your grandfather, Emma? Jake asked, his voice steady despite the emotion building in his chest like pressure behind a dam. He could feel the crowd pressing closer, could sense the cameras rolling and the phones recording, could practically hear the story being written in real time by journalists and bloggers who had come expecting a routine Memorial Day ceremony and found themselves witnessing something unprecedented. Emma pointed toward Section 60, the area of Arlington Cemetery that had become sacred ground for the families of service members who had died in Iraq and Afghanistan. Her small finger aimed with the precision of someone who had studied maps and memorized directions, not the vague gesture of a child indicating a general area. Over there, Section 60, Row 7, she said with the careful articulation of someone repeating information that had been drilled into her memory through repetition and importance. He said his number was on a stone, but I can't read all the words yet. Daddy says when I get bigger, I'll be able to read everything that tells people what Grandpa did. Sarah Chen's eyes filled with tears as the pieces fell into place for the crowd around them, as the full scope of what their family was carrying became clear to everyone present. David Chen's military bearing, his respectful attention during the ceremony, his daughter's sophisticated understanding of military protocols, all of it made sense now. This was a Gold Star family carrying the weight of a loss that had shaped their lives, seeking to honor a hero whose sacrifice had earned him a place among the nation's most revered dead. Jake felt the weight of thousands of eyes on him, the pressure of protocol and procedure, the responsibility of his position and his uniform. But he also felt something more powerful and more fundamental, the understanding that this moment was exactly why the honor guard existed, not for ceremonies or tourists or photo opportunities, but for moments like this when the living needed to connect with the dead, when a child's love for a grandfather she never met needed to be acknowledged by the soldiers who stood watch over his eternal rest. Major Hayes approached, her own face showing the internal battle between military order and human compassion that defined the best officers Jake had ever served under. She had been watching the interaction from her position near the ceremony platform, and Jake could see in her expression that she understood the significance of what was happening, even as she grappled with the implications for military protocol and procedure. Sergeant Morrison, she said, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of an officer trying to balance competing responsibilities, we need to consider the impact on the ceremony. The families present, the media attention, ma'am, Jake interrupted, respectfully but firmly, coming to attention while remaining kneeled next to Emma, a position that somehow managed to show respect for his commanding officer, while maintaining his connection to the child who had trusted him with her grandfather's location. This young lady has information about the precise location of her grandfather, Staff Sergeant James Chen, a fallen service member buried in Section 60. I believe this falls directly under our duty to honor and assist Gold Star families, and I believe Staff Sergeant Chen's granddaughter has earned the right to visit his grave. With a military escort, the major looked at Emma, then at the crowd of thousands watching this unprecedented moment unfold with the kind of absolute attention that comes when people realize they are witnessing history being made. News cameras were rolling, phones were recording from every angle. Social media was already buzzing with real-time updates, and the entire Memorial Day ceremony had become centered around one little girl's message to a soldier and that soldier's response to her call for help. But more than the media attention, more than the potential for viral videos and national news coverage, Major Hayes could see the faces of the other Gold Star families in the crowd. She could see the veterans straightening their shoulders, the active duty personnel in civilian clothes moving closer to show their support, the recognition in the eyes of people who understood that this moment represented something fundamental about military service and the bonds that connect the living with the dead. "What do you recommend, Sergeant?" Major Hayes asked, the question acknowledging that Jake's combat experience and his 3 years of working with grieving families at Arlington had given him insights that no manual or protocol could provide. Jake stood up, came to attention with the precision that had marked his service since the day he enlisted, and made a decision that would either end his military career or define it in ways he couldn't yet imagine. "I recommend we escort Miss Emma and her family to visit her grandfather." Man, the Honor Guard was created to serve the fallen and their families. Today, we have the opportunity to serve both simultaneously. He paused, looking at Emma and then back at Major Hayes. Staff Sergeant Chen served 3 deployments in Afghanistan. Before giving his life for his brothers in arms, his granddaughter has traveled 3,000 miles to tell us where he rests. Using a military distress signal, he taught her family to ensure that a soldier would listen when she had something important to communicate. I believe we have an obligation to respond to that communication with the same precision and dedication that Staff Sergeant Chen showed during his service. The major nodded once, a sharp movement that indicated a decision made and consequences accepted, whatever they might be. "Honor Guard, new mission," she announced, her voice carrying across the ceremony area with the authority of someone who had chosen to trust her soldiers' judgment over bureaucratic procedure. "We're going to Section 60 to honor Staff Sergeant James Chen and escort his family to his final resting place." What happened next would become the stuff of military legend, viral video fame, and family stories told for generations. But in the moment, it felt both monumental and completely natural, as if the entire ceremony had been building toward this single point of connection between the living and the dead. Major Hayes turned to address the crowd, her voice carrying through the portable sound system that had been set up for the ceremony. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you are witnessing today represents the highest traditions of military service and the sacred bonds that connect our fallen heroes with the families who love them. We are honored to escort the Chen family to visit Staff Sergeant James Chen, who gave his life in service to our nation and whose granddaughter has reminded us all why we stand guard over our honored dead." The entire Honor Guard formation turned with mechanical precision and began marching, not toward the parking area where the ceremony would normally conclude, but toward the rows of white headstones that marked the final resting places of America's most recent heroes. Jake walked alongside Emma, matching his military stride to her small steps, while David and Sarah Chen followed with Tommy, their faces showing a mixture of pride, grief, and amazement at the unprecedented honor being accorded to their family. But the truly extraordinary part wasn't the military escort or the breaking of protocol. It was what happened with the crowd. Instead of dispersing as crowds normally do when formal ceremonies conclude, the thousands of people who had come to Arlington that morning began to follow. Veterans straightened their shoulders and fell into informal formation behind the Honor Guard, their movements showing the muscle memory of decades of military service. Gold Star families joined the procession, understanding that they were witnessing something that honored not just Staff Sergeant Chen, but all the fallen heroes whose families had made similar pilgrimages to these sacred grounds. Active duty service members in civilian clothes revealed themselves by their bearing and their automatic positioning in the growing parade. Tourists became something more than tourists. They became participants in a moment that transcended typical ceremony and entered the realm of genuine tribute. Phones were put away as people recognized that this was something to be experienced, rather than recorded, something to be remembered in hearts, rather than documented for social media. The procession that formed behind Emma and the honor guard stretched for hundreds of yards. Thousands of people walking in respectful silence through Arlington Cemetery toward Section 60. It was completely unprecedented in the history of the cemetery. A spontaneous tribute that no protocol had ever envisioned, but that felt absolutely right to everyone involved. Emma led them through the cemetery with the confidence of a child who had memorized every detail of stories told by her father, every description of the route to her grandfather's grave, every landmark that would help her find the man she'd never met but loved deeply. She walked with purpose, her small hand occasionally reaching up to ensure that Jake was still beside her, her bright eyes scanning the headstones as they approached Section 60. Halfway through the walk, something happened that threatened to derail the entire procession. A reporter from a major news network, recognizing the viral potential of what was unfolding, pushed through the crowd with a camera crew in tow, attempting to get close enough to interview Emma and her family during their walk to the grave. "Excuse me, little girl," the reporter called out, her voice cutting through the respectful silence that had settled over the procession. "Can you tell our viewers why you're leading this parade? What made you signal to the soldier?" Jake's reaction was immediate and decisive. Without breaking stride, without disrupting Emma's focused march toward her grandfather's grave, he positioned himself between the reporter and the Chen family, his presence and his uniform making it clear that this was not the time or place for media interviews. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the polite firmness of someone accustomed to maintaining order in difficult situations, "this is a private family matter. I'm going to ask you to respect the dignity of this moment and allow this family to visit their fallen hero without media interference." The reporter pressed forward, recognizing a story that could define her career. "But Sergeant, this is news. The public has a right to know. The public has a right to witness," Major Hayes said, appearing beside Jake with the authority of her rank and her absolute certainty about what was appropriate in this moment. "But this family has a right to privacy in their grief and in their tribute to Staff Sergeant Chen. You are welcome to document this procession from a respectful distance, but you will not interfere with the Gold Star family's visit to their loved one's grave." The reporter started to argue, but the crowd around her had heard the exchange, and their reaction was swift and unmistakable. Veterans began forming a protective barrier around the Chen family, their bodies creating a buffer between the family and any media personnel who might attempt to disrupt the solemnity of the moment. Active duty personnel joined them, and within seconds, Emma and her family were surrounded by a protective escort of people who understood that some moments were too sacred for commercialization. The reporter and her crew fell back, recognizing that they had misread the situation and that any attempt to force access would result in confrontation with hundreds of military personnel and veterans who were not going to allow a child's tribute to her grandfather to be exploited for entertainment value. Emma seemed oblivious to the media drama unfolding around her. Her attention remained focused on the task her grandfather had given her through the stories her father told. Find his resting place, tell a soldier where he was, and make sure he wasn't forgotten among the thousands of heroes who shared his eternal home. As they reached Section 60, Emma's pace quickened slightly, not with excitement, but with the urgency of someone who could sense that her mission was almost complete. The white headstones stretched in perfect rows, each one marking a life cut short in service to country, each one representing a family forever changed by loss. Emma walked with the confidence of someone who had studied these directions countless times, her small feet carrying her down the 7th row with unerring precision. Behind her, the massive procession moved in respectful silence, thousands of people following an 8-year-old girl to pay tribute to a grandfather she had never met, but whose legacy had shaped her understanding of courage and sacrifice. Halfway down row 7, Emma stopped. The headstone before her was identical to thousands of others in Arlington Cemetery, white marble, precisely carved, dignified in its simplicity. But the words etched into its surface told a story that had shaped a family's life for 8 years. Staff Sergeant James Chen, U.S. Army, Afghanistan, Purple Heart, Bronze Star, Silver Star, loving father and grandfather. Emma stared at the headstone for a long moment, her young mind processing the reality of finally standing at the place where her grandfather rested. This was more than just a destination she had memorized from her father's stories. This was the physical connection to the man whose sacrifice had given meaning to every lesson about duty, honor, and service that her family had taught her. Jake stepped forward and read the inscription aloud, his voice carrying across the silent crowd that had gathered in a large semicircle around Staff Sergeant Chen's grave. The words seemed to hang in the air, each decoration and honor representing moments of courage that had cost James Chen everything, but had saved the lives of soldiers who had returned home to their own families. Then Jake did something that broke every rule in the Honor Guard manual, but honored every principle it was meant to protect. He came to attention, brought his white-gloved hand to his brow, and held a perfect military salute toward James Chen's headstone. The gesture was followed immediately by every member of the Honor Guard. 20 soldiers saluting a fallen brother they had never met, but whose service connected him to their own. But the salutes didn't stop with the Honor Guard. Throughout the crowd, veterans came to attention and saluted, their movements automatic and precise despite years away from active service. Active duty personnel in civilian clothes revealed themselves by their participation, their own salutes adding to the growing tribute. Even civilians who had never served placed their hands over their hearts, recognizing that they were witnessing something profound and wanting to contribute their own respect to the moment. Emma stepped forward and carefully placed her small American flag against the base of her grandfather's headstone, the flag she had carried from Seattle specifically for this moment. "I told them where you are, Grandpa," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but carrying clearly in the absolute silence that had settled over Section 60, "just like you taught Daddy to teach me. The soldiers know you're here now." David Chen knelt beside his daughter, his own emotions finally overwhelming the composure he had maintained throughout the morning. His father had been gone for 8 years, but in this moment, surrounded by thousands of people honoring James Chen's sacrifice, the grief felt as fresh as it had the day he'd received the notification of his father's death. "He would be so proud of you, Emma," David whispered, his voice thick with tears he had held back since they boarded the plane in Seattle. "So incredibly proud of the soldier you've become." Sarah Chen joined her husband and daughter at the graveside, her own tears flowing freely as she witnessed her 8-year-old daughter completing a mission that had taken more courage and determination than most adults would ever demonstrate. Tommy stood beside his mother, his 10-year-old mind finally understanding that his little sister had accomplished something extraordinary, something that would be part of their family story forever. The crowd remained perfectly still, allowing the Chen family their moment of private grief within the public tribute. Veterans wiped away their own tears, remembering their own fallen brothers and sisters, their own families who had made similar pilgrimages to gravesites around the world. Gold Star families held each other a little tighter, recognizing their shared experience of loss and the bittersweet comfort that came from seeing their loved ones honored by strangers who understood the true cost of freedom. Jake knelt down next to Emma one final time, bringing himself to her eye level for what he sensed would be their last conversation of this extraordinary day. "Your grandfather was right to teach you that signal, Emma," he said, his voice gentle but carrying the weight of absolute sincerity. "And he was right to trust that a soldier would listen. When you used it, you've honored him today in a way that will be remembered for a very long time." Emma looked up at Jake with the serious expression that had marked her throughout this entire experience. "Will you remember where he is?" she asked. "Will you tell the other soldiers who guard this place that Staff Sergeant James Chen is here and that he was brave and that his family still loves him?" "That's a promise," Jake said, offering Emma a handshake with the same gravity and respect he would give to a fellow soldier. "Every soldier who serves at Arlington will know about Staff Sergeant Chen and about the granddaughter who made sure he would never be forgotten." As their hands met his large and scarred from combat, hers tiny and soft with childhood, Emma smiled for the first time that day, an expression of relief and accomplishment that transformed her serious young face into something radiant with joy.